Right, welcome back everybody. Welcome back to our very last session of this lecture series. Semester has gone by really quickly, and I think it was a great pleasure to have all these different perspectives, all these different nationalities, all these different universities gathered here within this lecture series. Today we have our very last AURORA station. It's going to be Reykjavik in Iceland, and Dirk will tell you a little bit more about this later on. Before we start, I would just like to address the exam conditions. If you look at the website that we've put up, you find a lot of information there. Let me just remind you that we want an essay. You find the word count there. And we would put the end of the semester, which is end of February, as a due date. If you have any trouble complying with this due date, please send us an email. You know, we're very accommodating, and it's not going to be a problem. We just need to hear from you so that we know that there's something coming from you. If you have questions, you can always send an email to me or to Dirk or to Christian. We're always there for you the entire February. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact us. I think that's it for the administrative topics today. Before we start here, let me just quickly remind you of what we talked about last week. We had 2 lectures. In fact, we had 2 lectures from Olmütz University. Pavlina Flesherova and Jiri Flesher talked about British and American perspectives. And it reminded me very much how our European university system is set up, and how important these role models, these US, American and British role models are. And I think we can see this more and more. And I think it's very important that we don't forget about not only the cultural capital and university education brings, but also the symbolic capital that a university brings to the table when we talk about how we deal with social issues, and diversity definitely is one of the most important social issues. We have a huge influence from the United States, from Ivy League universities, from the ancient universities in England, but also from the the growing field of higher education in both countries. And of course, that's been very influential for our take on diversity and other issues as well. It'll be interesting to see how Reykjavik models themselves after the Anglophone tradition, or maybe not. That would be one of the questions. But before we get to that, Dirk will introduce our speaker today, and we're very happy to have you here.
Yes, welcome also from my side. It's a pleasure to have you all back for our Brown Bag lecture series. Unfortunately, the last time. But as Silke said, it's really a pleasure now. I mean, we had our most southern outlets from the AURORA University Alliance in Naples, and now we're finally at the most northern part in Iceland, at the University of Iceland in Reykjavik. And it's really a pleasure to have Brynja Halldórsdóttir Gudjonsson with us. Only Brynja, not together with her colleague Karen Root, as was actually announced in our program. But Brynja can cover it all alone because she had all important positions for that, so that she can tell us about the Icelandic way of dealing with diversity in higher education. Brynja is currently an associate since last year, actually associate professor and head of the Faculty of Education and Diversity, as you can see on her slides, associate professor in critical education studies. She did her BA, MA, and PhD in the US at the University of Minnesota. As far as I can see it, you started out with literature and Russian studies, Bulgakov, Master and Margarita, and then moved on to a second language acquisition in your MA in comparative international development education, and then a PhD in educational policy and administration at the University of Minnesota 2012, with a thesis on multiracial teen identity development and experiences of appeasement and objection in a monoracialized context. All topics that are very relevant to the huge field that we opened up here in our lecture series. Brynja held different positions and was involved in different research projects at the University of Iceland. For us, most important is that she was head of the Equality Committee of the School of Education, and is now head of the Equality Committee of the whole University of Iceland, which gives her a great overview over our topic. It's really a pleasure to have you. Thanks for taking your time, and with that, I hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. This is an exciting opportunity. I've done a couple of these sort of meetings with other institutions, and it's always a real joy, because you have an opportunity to have a conversation with people working in other fields, as you were talking about earlier, and at other institutions. Yeah, so I was going to, the way that I usually lecture, and yes, I have an American accent. My mother was an American, so I speak fluent English and fluent Icelandic, no accent in either language. If I talk too fast, just please let me know, because I can do that. I'd like the way that I've structured the talk today is I wanted to start with sort of some context about Iceland, some context about the university, a little bit about me, because I'm very much in the critical theory areas of, placing myself within the context of where I work. So, what's my background to bring me there? And as Dirk mentioned, I have this really sort of diverse, broad perspective from my undergraduate and graduate degrees. So I'd like to just sort of start by talking a little bit about Iceland, because I find that people don't realize how small Iceland actually is. I mean, there are only about 380,000 people. So to put that in perspective, where I lived in Minnesota, which is Minneapolis-St. Paul, which is the capital, St. Paul is the capital of Minnesota, and it's a huge state with about land mass-wise, with about 5 to 6 million people, and the city of St. Paul itself has 380,000 people. The university I went to had 60,000 students. It's one of the largest universities in the United States. 14% of our population in the past it's gone from being about 2% in the late 90s to being 14% of our population are immigrants. And the largest proportion of those are Polish speakers, and then Lithuanian speakers. And then after that, in terms of minority groups, I mean, the Europeans make up a big group in general. After that, the largest sort of non-ethnically white European groups that are here are Filipino and Thai. And this has been growing over the past years significantly, especially after the economic crash of 2008. We regularly top the global equity lists. It's usually the 4-5 Scandinavian Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and Finland are somewhere up at the top all the time. But there is a running and growing debate. Some of the faculty here in gender studies have looked at this, and what it's saying doesn't necessarily really give a clear picture of what kind of gender equity there really is. It depends on where you look. We have a high representation of women in parliament. We have a reasonably high representation of women leading companies. We've done extremely well with the Me Too. In fact, we're going through another Me Too moment in the past couple of weeks, where women have come out and accused men of sexual abuse. And these are very powerful men within this tiny little society who have subsequently resigned from very public positions, including radio and media people and high-end business men. So there are very strong Me Too repercussions within the society. 85% of our women work. It's odd if women aren't working. And this is in part due to some of the legal foundations and educational foundations that were laid in the 70s. In the 70s, they produced preschools especially for single mothers, so that single mothers could get into the workforce, and that became the universal child care. So from 18 months to 6 years, children have the right and can go to kindergartens, and they are all the majority of these kindergartens are publicly run and publicly subsidized by the government. There is a bit of a narrowing of this recently because we haven't been producing enough teachers, because in order to teach at any school level in Iceland, you have to have a master's degree. So there was a bit of a narrowing because people weren't seeing the financial benefit of getting a 5-year degree and then going and teaching in preschools or primary schools, because the salaries weren't particularly good. We're not as competitive about it as Finland is, for example, where it's actually highly competitive and well paid to become a teacher. The way that we work with the equality pieces is that we work with laws that have been around since 1944. 1944 is when Iceland gains full independence and becomes its own democracy. In 1918, we became sort of an independent entity, but we're still run by the Danish crown. So we actually have a very long colonial history that goes along with, the Faroe Islands and Greenland. So there is this sort of underneath all of this in sort of the Icelandic identity is this unspoken sort of knowledge that we were a colonial country, that we were colonized by Denmark. They ran everything for a very long time. For example, they dictated who could move to Iceland and who couldn't. And then for a very long time, the only people that could come here were Danes. And so all of our traders were Danes and all of that. So there's this very long history of something that we don't necessarily really talk about or isn't up on the thing. So our laws, from 1944 have to do with gender equality. The same is true of the 95 and 2020 laws, where they're looking at equalizing the number of women in various places within society. But then in the last 4 or 5 years, there's been an increasing attention to looking at equity from a broader perspective. And that led to legal frameworks being introduced in 2018 on discrimination based on color or nationality, support for people with disabilities. And we have ratified the UN agreement on people with disabilities. And in 2019, we also passed a law around people being able to select their own gender identification, much the same as was done in Germany not so long before that. So, we are following these sort of European laws, and we look really good on paper, and we do fairly well. But one of the concerns is that equity and equality as a term in Icelandic, jafnrétti, has been centered around this sort of male-female binary dichotomy of, making sure that everybody is, we're equal representation of women wherever we're at. It's one of the reasons why I think the equality committees here are complex, because we actually have a legal requirement that 40% of any committee have to be women. Which is now even more complicated, because where do we put ourselves when we have gender nonconforming people? And so now, how do we construct a committee that also should have representation from gender nonconforming people? The University of Iceland itself was founded in 1911. It is therefore the oldest institution of higher education, and it has been responsible for some of the more, I don't even know what the word is. It's been responsible for educating lawyers, religious roles, and medical roles for most of that time, and then it has expanded slowly since then. It is large. We have 380,000 people, and we have 7 institutions of higher education. 4 of them are more broadly higher education institutions. So they'll offer teaching licensure, they'll offer literature degrees, history, computer science, that kind of thing. And then there are some more specialized ones in agriculture. There are 2 agriculture ones, and the one agriculture one is focused on fisheries. So there's a bit of a diversity in the institutions. So not all of them are focused on the broad thing, but we are the largest. We have 15,000 students and nearly 2,000 faculty members, as well as administrative staff. And we educate across all sectors. So we educate doctors and nurses, we educate engineers, computer scientists. And since 2008, the School of Education has been part of the university. Prior to that, it was its own institution of higher education that was made up of what's called social educators, which are people who work with people with disabilities, whether they're intellectual disabilities or physical disabilities. There's a specific licensure process for them. Teachers, sports and after-school program type things. So all of these things come together in the 90s, and then that moves up to being a research institute when they shift into being part of the University of Iceland. So it's a really big institution in terms of the size of the population and where it's located, and it has it's a public institution, so it has a big role politically, and it's funded politically. It's funded by political funds. It's funded by the government. So in some respects, we're kind of bound by what the government expects from us, and that has implications for how we do diversity at the university, because we have to follow what the government is trying to do, and also on the other end, which I think is the fun part of these kinds of jobs, is that we also get to set what might happen within the government structure, because we get to offer our support, offer our understanding of things within the university and then within society. So it's a two-way street here within the institution. At the university, the policies are still called equality policies. And I struggle a little bit with that concept because, though, as I said before, the word jafnrétti is usually used to refer to gender equity. And the policies that I've seen and I've worked on in the past 9 years were primarily and still are primarily focused on this gender aspect, although with this introduction of the 2018 laws, we were able to shift the focus a little bit more towards looking at things like immigrant status, racial identity, gender in a broader sense, and ability and disability. So we've started slowly moving in that direction, and this most recent equity policy is probably the furthest along in looking at diversity, not just looking at gender equity. And we set up, so there's a central committee which is made up of the chairs from the 5 schools, plus a student representative, plus a representative from the central administration. And all of these, except for the student, are nominated by the rector. So the head of the university picks the people, and it turns out it's actually quite a complicated puzzle because of this 40% rule. So sometimes, like for example, currently with the School of Education's committee, it's headed by Karen Rutt, who couldn't come today, but the person that comes to the main meetings is my colleague Yoni, but because we had to have this equal distribution of men, and very often, because the School of Education is predominantly female, the staff is predominantly female, which is common in education across the board, especially in primary and preschool levels, and then hence at the faculty level as well. So they're trying to sort of open it up so that there's male representation from the School of Education. So it was a very complicated puzzle that the rector had to work with. And then we have 2 permanent staff equality officers that are, I think, in like a 50%, maybe a 75% position. And they sort of do all of the coordination. They keep track of things. They regularly meet with the vice rector for research to have conversations about issues that need to be addressed and stuff like that. And the Equality Committee sets a policy for 3 years, and usually our policy is based on the most recent strategic plan of the University of Iceland. And we just happen to be so lucky that this most recent policy came out exactly at the same time that the university was rewriting its strategic plan. So we had both input from the development of the strategic plan, but we also had input in the opposite direction. When we read through the draft of the strategic plan, we said, oh, wait a minute, you're not doing equity here. We're not looking at diversity. You're missing, having these terms in here. They need to be focused somewhere. And I was sent then to a general university-wide meeting where I had to announce that they weren't doing what we expected them to do in terms of focusing on the equality and equity within the school. As the chair, I have to meet regularly with the rector. I have to go to these university-wide meetings that they have annually or biannually. We also are asked frequently to give our opinion on legal frameworks that are being developed. So, for example, we did offer a legal opinion on the recent 2019 gender registration committee law. So we went and read through it as a committee. We then had a discussion, and we then sent that in, and we were deliberately asked by the government to have this opinion and come back because people that are on this committee are most of the time specialists in some form of gender equity or in some form of equity and across the board. And we actually, this time around, we have a fairly broad base of representation. So, me with my critical education theory focused on critical race theory. We have somebody that does queer theory work. We have somebody that does gender theory. So we have this nice broad representation of knowledge base to work with so that we're not just focused on one area of equity and diversity, which makes a huge difference in terms of what we do. We also have annual equality days, and those are across all 7 institutions of higher education. They're actually a unified day or week where we have all kinds of conversations across the institutions and then within our institutions, and anybody can apply to have an event during these equality days. So we often get a lot of student-led events, and we often, like this year, we will start with a panel of the various rectors from the various institutions, and then we'll end with a panel of students to have this sort of conversation about what is equality, what is equity, and what are we doing at the universities, and how does this fit into how the students understand it. So it'll be an interesting sort of conversation, and in the middle of it, the committee has sponsored a public talk on cancel culture. So we've gotten 2 well-known academics to do some talk who have written about cancel culture, and we've gotten a panel together, including some famous Icelanders from outside of the institution, as well as people from inside the institution, to have a dialogue around cancel culture, because that's been a very big part of the media and of Icelandic culture for the last couple of months, but around these men that are coming out as being accused of having committed sexual harassment or sexual violence. And we support a variety of different equity initiatives and research. We have a collaboration with the Women's Studies or the Gender Studies program, where we get a list every semester for a course of research, potential research projects for students, and then we help the students work through these research projects, and they'll go and do research projects within the institution or outside of the institution and report back to us. So we have this sort of ongoing dialogue with teachers, with students, which makes for a stronger ability to do this equity work as we're more informed by the population that we're working with. And I think that that is a huge advantage to what we do. And then I was going to say a little bit about myself, and I forgot to take the institution in Iceland off. This is part of when I was thinking about it. So as Dirk mentioned, I'm the head of education and diversity, which is made up of 3 different departments. And one is the social education that I mentioned before. One is the international studies and education, which it was originally developed to have immigrants start attending university. It was one of the problems that we noticed, was that immigrants weren't coming to the university because they didn't feel comfortable speaking in Icelandic. Icelandic is the main language of communication. It's really it's a very difficult language to learn. It's very complicated. Think of German and Russian combined, and then add French verbs into it, and you've kind of got sort of a basic understanding of the language. And so they offered this program in English, and that it's slowly grown over the last 9 or 10 years. And we have both immigrants and students that come here specifically for that program. And then we have an education studies, which is sort of a theoretical-based, research-based program. So none of these programs, well, the social education leads to licensure, but the other 2 don't. I have been the chair for 2 years now. As Dirk said before, I was the former chair. I have a PhD in comparative international development education. And as you were listing my degrees, I realized that they actually are all connected, but they're also disconnected. Coming to Iceland made me realize that I'm actually a feminist. I didn't realize I was a feminist until I got here. I knew I was a critical race theorist. I knew I was really interested in sort of racial identity and racial issues. And then I came here and realized that, oh, wait a minute, I wrote about women's experiences in Bulgakos, the Master and Margarita. That was my BA thesis. So I've been at this for, I don't know how long anymore. And I currently have been writing and publishing on internationalization in higher education, sort of trying to pull the university out into this sort of more global sense of being part of the community, because Icelandic students, for example, don't tend to take courses in English. They feel, even though they learn English from an early age, they don't feel confident enough to do it. And the few times that we've been able to get them to do it, it's been because we've explained that the majority of the people in international studies aren't speaking English as their native language either. So they're on a sort of level playing field. And I've been was fortunate enough to get a large national grant to study immigrant women's experiences of gender-based violence, both in the workplace and in intimate partners. And that's a 3-year project that's ongoing. And I am influenced by a lot of different people, but the ones that primarily sort of draw me in are Bell Hooks, Angela Davis, Judith Butler, and Sarah Ahmed. So for me, all of that, I think, plays into how I work with equity in this context of, leading these committees at the university level, and how I envision change within the institution, because, institutions are big things. They're slow, they're old, and they don't necessarily want to change. So sometimes it's a matter of dragging them along and pushing them forward, which takes a lot. I wanted to go into a little bit of these terms, because we don't always have the same understanding of what these terms mean. I often use equity and equality interchangeably in English because they are sort of on the same wavelength. But if you have seen that little cartoon of the three people in the three boxes where everybody gets a box, which is sort of the indication of equality, all the resources are divided up the same, everybody gets the same amount, that's sort of equality. Whereas equity is much more of a, the person that needs the most boxes gets the most boxes, and the one that doesn't need a box, doesn't need to get a box. And so it's sort of more of a leveling the playing field. And then a more recent version of this cartoon has come out where instead of having this fence where people are peering over the fence on these different boxes, the fence is removed. And for me, that's sort of the meaning of diversity. It's getting rid of the barriers that affect a variety of different people. It's not focused on gender. It's not focused on one area. And this leads sort of into the direction of, what Kimberly Crenshaw talks about in terms of intersectionality. Now we're looking at all of the aspects of the individual, all of the aspects of the group, and making it possible for them to be full participants in that situation. And that so diversity work is more complicated by nature. Diversity and equity work are much more complicated by nature because we're not just looking at one focus point, which is complicated because lots of people have, you have your passion, you have your interest in one area, and maybe aren't so well up on other areas that need attention. And that's, I think, one of the advantages of being in this position and working in this work for me is I'm interested in the whole. I like looking at things systemically. And so for me, the ability to learn about ability and disability, the ability to, learn about all these different isms or different experiences is hugely enriching and allows me to develop as a person and as an intellectual and academic, but also allows me to work towards a university that is accessible for everybody, which is a main primary function of this institution. I mean, it's one of the things that other Nordic universities have moved towards, students having to pay tuition and stuff like that. And if I'm not sure how it is in your context, but here you pay a registration fee, which is the equivalent of maybe 500 euros a year. And anybody with a degree, a secondary school degree, can apply to join the University of Iceland. And this is a major national sort of moment of pride, and it's written into sort of the institution that this should be an institution that's accessible for everybody, which isn't necessarily the case, which is why we have to have equity committees. As I said before, we've had a lot of social changes that have had a significant impact on the policy changes within the university. As I said, gender equity, gender equality was the primary focus. But this sort of Me Too movement has shifted that a little bit. And there was a moment where Immigrant Women actually took out a two-page long request for change, as well as shared stories of their experiences. So they sort of pushed themselves into the forefront of a conversation that had been happening in other professional groups. There was a women's group for academia, there was one for theater, there was one for sports, and they were all centered around sort of this Icelandic aspect of it. And then Immigrant Women came in and sort of blew everybody out of the water because the Icelanders were completely unaware of the issues that immigrant women were experiencing. The laws that I mentioned before have allowed us to take this policy and develop something that's more robust, that's responding to the needs of students with disabilities and faculty with disabilities. Because it's not just, that's one of the things that I think that we often forget in our conversations is we're responding to student needs. That's like the primary thing, because the institution, that the purpose of the institution is to educate students for the societies. But at the same time, in order for students to find themselves in the institution, they have to see representation of themselves. So we're also looking at how to make this an inclusive workplace. It's a focus on how to make it an inclusive learning space, but also an inclusive workspace. So we've been able to have those conversations, and it's one of the more difficult ones that the institution is engaged in right now, because Iceland has been this sort of island of people that look the same, they speak the same, except for if you come from the north, you might have a slightly different accent, but it's the same language across the board, that kind of thing. And now with this shift, we're not seeing the same 14% representation within the faculty, within the administrative staff. And there's this conversation that's been happening slowly of, why are we not hiring more minorities? Why are we not hiring people outside of the usual white middle class groupings that we get within the institution? And it's a bit of a struggle because there's this conversation around, well, we have a specific work environment, and we're very, we want somebody that fits into our work environment, at which point my hand goes up and says, well, that's a little racist. So can we maybe, think about that a little bit differently? How can we have a conversation about changing the work environment so that people do feel like they can come into this work environment? So it's an interesting conversation to have. And sometimes I feel a bit like a broken record. We have 9 research institutions at the university that focus on equity, but they're all located classically in the humanities and social sciences and in education. And so, the medical or the health sciences and the natural sciences don't really actually have that kind of focus at all. In fact, we often get, well, why do I need to think about diversity? I'm just teaching mathematics, or I'm teaching geography. Why is that important in this conversation? So it's a conversation that we've continued to have, and as I'll go into in a moment, I will explain some of the things that has resulted in our ability to have this conversation. So recently, our major concerns are, how limited is our impact. We've been getting a lot of feedback from students around non-gender identified toilets, for example. There's a lot of pressure. There's about 5 of the 20 buildings that the university has and runs that have no toilets that are ungender assigned. So they're both either male or female. So there's a lot of pushback from students to develop, for us to change this, which has been complicated because there's actually a law that says that we have to have a certain number of gendered restrooms in each building. So that's been a little complicated in terms of trying to get around the law in order to make students more comfortable, make people, non-gender binary students and faculty more comfortable within the institution. One of the biggest issues that we've had in all of the committees is people's reluctance to serve. So it's very difficult because people don't think of equity as a super important topic. It's not as exciting in the academic circles as, sitting on a science committee or sitting on the teaching committee. This is just sort of, there's a couple of people who are really into this stuff. Well, they could take care of it. So it's quite difficult to get people on the committees. And for example, the natural sciences didn't have a committee for many, many years. They had one, and then the head of the dean decided it wasn't important and shut it down. And so they had a representative, but they had no backup, which is what the committees at the school, at each school level are there for, is you get 4 or 5 people together and they can go out into their faculties and have these conversations. And that is really key in terms of getting the diversity equity work done. The other thing is, of course, is we're always preaching to the choir. You have an event And the only people that show up are the people that are interested in it. We're not reaching the faculty or the students or the administrative staff who need this, who need to know that, you can't say, okay, boys, let's, or okay, guys, let's do, that's just not okay. Or you need to change your reading so that we're not reading all dead white guys, and those are, things and concerns that, people that are interested in equality and equity are going to pay attention to, but the people that aren't, they're missing the boat because they aren't not getting informed. Often we don't take into account diversity. We had a recent issue with some of our international studies students who signed up for a statistics course that was in the system, registered as being taught in English and Icelandic, and so they signed up for it. It was, and then their first day of class, the professor said, no, this is only going to be taught in Icelandic. So they had to, at the beginning of the semester, scramble to find different course to fulfill their ECTs, even though it was in the course manual, which by sort of dint of being in the course manual is the rule, right? So but because there is no set policy on language and not changing languages, the faculty member was able to get away with this. So they're not necessarily, people are not taking diversity into account. I've gotten data around students who speak Icelandic but don't look Icelandic being told, oh, you don't have to come to discussion class anyway, you wouldn't understand what's going on, even though this person was speaking in Icelandic. So there are, all these sort of attitudes that we're working with that aren't necessarily, right in your face. We're not talking about, somebody being super sexist to your face or although that's happened too, or being super racist or ableist to your face. But there are all these pieces of institutions that have just always been there and we never think about them. And sort of the whole purpose of this work is to bring this uncomfortable stuff to light and be annoying. And as Sarah Ahmed calls us, being a feminist killjoy, you go into someplace and you say, no, I don't think that's funny. Don't do that again. I had first meeting I ever had with the School of Education's Equality Committee. One of the guys on the committee came in and told a sexist joke. And I hadn't been here more than, 2-3 years. And I looked at him and I said, yeah, we don't talk like that. And that was it. I was just like, this is not appropriate. But he thought it was okay in an equality committee meeting to make a sexist joke. So, it happens. Institutions by nature are conservative. They're old. They have their ways of doing things, they have their pipe, they have their slippers, they have, and they fit well, and the chair is comfortable, and we don't really want to, change. So, it's a slow, often quite tedious process. And at the same time, we also have to be careful that we're not focusing on, individual pet projects to the exclusion of other projects or other needs. And that makes it complicated because you have to pull people along, and then you have other people who are really gung-ho. Why aren't things changing yet? And so there's this sort of strange balance that you have to play. And that leads to, sort of strategic planning and strategic thinking, which is not necessarily something that the university has a long history with, because Iceland is so small and everybody knows everybody else. One of the things that's really interesting about the institution is there are so many unwritten rules or policies, unspoken things that if you come into the institution from outside, you don't know about. And so, and there hasn't been, it's changing, but there's no sort of long-term documentation of sort of processes. So, coming in, at least with the Equality and Equity Committee, we've been at it for 20 years. We had our 200th meeting just yesterday. So, we have a 20-year process, but that's really not very long. I mean, that's 2002. So it's not, we've got sort of documented processes from then, But, we really need to look at this, and I see this as, because equity and diversity are a long-term project, we have to see this strategically as a long-term project, and we can have little pet projects or special issues that we address, but then as a broad understanding of it, we need to, keep this sort of line of pulling us along to embrace the diversity. And so what we've done, and in the past few years, and I'm almost up on time, which is lucky because I think this is my last slide, is that we have tried to be as broad-minded as possible. And we did things like institutionally, we made people responsible. So we have, say, the head of the teaching department is in charge of certain aspects of diversity in teaching. So we identified individuals within within the institution who bore responsibility for these changes. And as a result, we had to send those changes and those requests to those people, get feedback from them. Yes, I can do this, or maybe you should word it this way or that way. And then them to confirm it so that we could actually publish this public document and allow for us to actually engage in this activity actively instead of it just sort of being sort of a tick box thing. And what we wanted to do, and what a key piece is, this improved training and education, which is what there is one more slide, and I think I'll quickly skip over the rest of this. And we did look at, impacts on COVID. That's actually in process. And a lot of the things that are in our policy are actually in process, and we've been checking in with the various individuals. And what we've done in the School of Education, they recently signed a contract, a 3-year contract, I believe, with the main LGBTQI plus NGO to come into the School of Education to give training and informational sessions, both for our faculty as well as for the students who are about to go out into the schools and teach our children. So that was a really an important move to get sort of external people to come in and inform us, so that it wasn't just us talking about things, but we were actually connecting directly to society. They've created monthly equality conversations where they invite teachers from the schools to come in and have conversations around equality and diversity and equity. One of the faculty has a sort of an international queer lecture series that he's gotten people intellectuals from all over the globe, Cambodia, Iran, all of that, to come and give virtual seminars. And they're publicly open and advertised. As I said before, the School of Natural Sciences didn't have a committee. The woman that is in charge of that committee in the past 2 years established a committee. So they now have a functioning committee. They just finished putting together their own strategic plan on equity issues. So we've actually managed to push something that was majorly difficult into fruition. The social sciences, oddly enough, had a defunct committee and people were unwilling to serve, and we actually had repeated conversations with the dean about the importance of it, and they finally have a functioning committee. And one of the things that we got done that we're actually quite proud of, that we found out last week, is we had a meeting with the rector after our collaborative meeting for all of the equality committees, where we proposed a cross-institutional set of trainings for 5 years. It was a 5-year plan with different foci each year. One was gender identity and non-binary. One is around sexual harassment, and one is around microaggressions and so forth and so on. And each year there are 4 different topics, and they will be addressed across the institution. And the way that the committee structured it is that we'll make short informational videos with a set of questions, and then they're taken not into you can come to this meeting and it's really interesting, but actually they go into the faculty meetings, the general faculty meetings. So we have to have a minimum of 2 faculty meetings a term, and all faculty members are required to attend. So what we've done is we've gotten a captive audience for this institutional informational stuff. And then there'll be sort of, if you're more interested, you can follow this here and there. And we met with the rector last week, and we really were well prepared and super excited and everything. And it was like a 5-minute conversation. The rector said, yeah, this looks pretty good. I could give you 3 years of funding for this. And that was it. It was the most amazing sort of institutional conversation I've had in a long time, because usually when you go to people and ask for money, they're like, I'm not sure. I'll have to look at it. He's like, no. So yeah, we managed to get this really super big change. Now we have to actually do it, though. So we'll see what happens. But that's it, I guess, in a nutshell.
Well, thank you so much for raising all these points, and I think that what just strikes me now is that you said you underlined that this is in process. Yeah, we are all. This is a part of social change, and if we really go to that meta level, we are changing society, hopefully. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very fitting for Aurora, because social entrepreneurship is an important goal of this initiative. But it's kind of we're on the way. And mm-hmm. sometimes you have these, amazing steps that you go and talk to your rector, and he goes like, yeah, okay, you can have that. And it shows you that you actually come a long way. But well, at the same time, you have situations where you think, I can't believe that I have to explain to you, my colleague, my appreciated, highly intelligent, well-educated colleague, that this is actually important. Mm-hmm. And that not only the people who research this should be on committees, because, as you said, this is preaching to the converted, but also this has to go across boards. And I think that's kind of the reality in higher education. Mm-hmm. And we've come a long way, but there's still some way to go. Mm-hmm. And I think we could talk a little bit about similarities maybe between Austrian universities and Icelandic ones, because I see that we have one question in the chat that asked for a quota at Austrian universities. We do have it. Dirk, you know a little bit more about this. Maybe you want to comment and maybe draw attention to some parallels between those universities.
Yeah, it's actually. Thank you so much for the talk. It was very fascinating, and I'm really glad that you told us a little bit about Iceland. I think we don't have it so present, and it's really amazing. So I guess everybody in Iceland knows everybody, right? That's no kidding. It must be like that. It's Innsbruck is like 130,000 people, the city. And it's a little bit weird to talk about the metropolitan area around Innsbruck, but I think mm-hmm. that's around 300,000. Mm-hmm. And Tyrol together would already be double the population of Iceland. Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. so it's it's really an extremely interesting setting, and I think especially for this topic. So this. There's also this first question actually that addresses that. How is it dealing with diversity in such a small scale, you could say, right? Mm-hmm. And so how does that change? And you have this also. Since you studied in the US, you also have another perspective with other scales. That's a very interesting question, I think. How does that change talking about diversity? Also, when we talk about these groups of immigrants in Iceland, which are for most of the countries, I think in Europe, we're talking about Central Europe, Germany, Austria, it's not the usual groups. So it's mm-hmm. also an interesting question if you know how you actually perceive immigrants from Poland and Lithuania compared to immigrants from Asia. So mm-hmm. I don't know. And we can come to the other questions later. I also say something to the quota because there's actually a similarity to Austria. But maybe you can address this a little bit more. I mean, the question of scale. That's so interesting. Also with this, as you said, I mean, that's also very unusual in Europe, of course, that you have a country with a colonial past, and not in terms of being the colonizer,
Right.
but being colonized by another European country. That's also, of course, an extremely specific setting, right? I mean, you might know we have these enormous discussions in Germany, less so in Austria, about the forgotten colonial history of certainly of Germany, and it's even a more complicated debate in Austria, with no classical overseas colonialism, but nonetheless, of course, a colonial legacy in Europe. So it's anyway. So that's also a very, very specific feature for a European country. So maybe you can reflect on these two points a little bit, how that changes or formats the specific Iceland environment.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I mean to start with the sort of the colonial conversation. It's interesting because since I've come back here, and I came back with this sort of critical race theory lens, which was the focus of my doctoral thesis in the U.S. And I came back with this conversation, and people were really sort of very shocked about my referring to this colonial legacy, because one of the things that happens in the late 1800s and then in the 1911, 1918, when they're trying to form this sort of modern national identity, is this push towards not recognizing this, that we are actually a strong, a vibrant people that come from and have these Nordic roots, and that this colonial thing, we're not going to really, we're not going to suffer under the yoke of the Danish crown anymore. They've treated us really badly, but we're also going to sort of selectively forget it. And so having that conversation in modern times, we're in a society, so small that where everybody basically thinks they're middle class. And there's no class discussion whatsoever. I have a colleague here who's been researching on class and school choice and using sort of that Bourdieuian concepts that you talked about at the beginning, culture, economic, and social capital, to look at how Icelanders understand themselves. And so we have this, we talk about having a goldfish memory. We have this really good ability to sort of put things out of our head. I mean, I was raised to think that the majority of the Icelanders were actually of Nordic descent, but it turns out that the majority of us are actually probably Irish and Scottish. We're actually Celtic because there was a large population. They stole a bunch of Irish and Celtic people when they came here in 872. So these mythologies that have allowed us to sort of ignore that idea of a colonial background, but you still see it in that, we have to be the best in the world. There's this whole, and there's a running Icelandic joke about being best in the world. And of course we can be that because there are 5 of us, there aren't that many of us. So, it is true that, we don't know everybody. I don't know everybody that, but I'm also an odd in an odd situation because, I come in under the radar. I speak Icelandic fluently. My name is Icelandic. I look like everybody else. When I first started here, we had this session for faculty writing academic papers, and it was, a large portion of the faculty from the School of Education. And I was sitting in the back of the classroom because that's the kind of student I am. And I raised my hand and asked a question, and the whole room turned around to see who the American in the room was, because they had never heard me speak English. And, I opened my mouth and I don't talk like this, and they don't understand, because most Icelanders have this very strong, very specific Icelandic English accent. So for me, coming into this institution, I didn't know everybody. But people within this institution do, oh, you can talk to so-and-so. They know about this, that, or the other thing. So I've spent, years figuring out this part, which has sort of led me to some of this work with the diversity in that, trying to bring all of these processes, these implicit processes within the institution up onto the surface. Why, when we hire a minority staff person, do they quit within 2 years? What was it that happened in that person's experience? Well, we don't know. Yeah, we probably do if we have a conversation about what kind of support did we offer, what kind of responses were they getting from students, all kinds of things that need to be discussed that, normally aren't discussed here. So yeah, it makes it easier. It makes it easier that it's also overall a relatively conformist society, so nobody really wants to stand out too much. So, we've all bought into, gender equality is important, that queer people should be able to get married. You should be able to identify, your gender however you want. All of that, we're all willing to buy into these things. But at the same time, the part that's the hard part is all of the implicit biases. It's all the underlying racism and sexism and all of these things that we're ashamed to have a conversation about. And that makes it
and I think that's really important to address that in a setting where where sort of equality or equity has become the new normal, because we're all kind of buying into it. It's even more difficult to address the implicities of gender-based violence, because this doesn't happen here. It might happen in this large university here and there, but not with us. And I think here we need the research to really ethnographic research to know what it's like to be in an unmarked or in a marked position. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's really the question of scaling is really interesting, and I can so relate to this, because I come from Germany and I have a super typical German name, very typical for the north of Germany. And I mean, in any sort of larger institution, I would never give my name when I ring. I always give sort of a registry number, because when I say Silkemeyer in Germany, they're just going to laugh at me and say, we have hundreds of Silkemeyers. And in Austria, I give my name and they say, oh yeah, I've got you right here. And so this is this idea that I can't actually, hide in the crowd. But still, it's kind of a nice thing. But there is the question of smallness, as it's said in the question here, really does add a quality to it. And I'm sure, and I mean, within the University of Innsbruck, which is to me a smaller university, I have studied and worked at larger universities. I can feel this quality, especially with questions like this, because you can talk to people, people, But again, as you said, it's also sometimes more difficult to address certain questions because people. Absolutely.
And you become complacent. It's easy to become very complacent in this work too. Oh, we've done that. We've checked that box. Let's move on to the next thing. And, why is she coming back with this again? And we already just dealt with this. We have these things in process, but are they working? And so it's interesting to be in a small institution. And I have to keep reminding people here of that. It's we do it really well. Yes, we do, but there are only so many people.
Can I also ask, because you mentioned that at the very beginning, that there's a sort of like a northern supremacy in international comparison, that Scandinavian countries rank really high on this. And I asked myself, obviously you need the infrastructure, you need the laws, but it had to be started. Why is it that the Scandinavians are so bloody good at so many things?
It's a really good question. I think that, I think one of the things, even if you look at the other Nordic countries, because they're still relatively small, there aren't, there's only, 4 or 5 million. And because conformity is so important, within these societies. And, and we all kind of look the same. I have a picture of my high school girlfriends, and we look like we could be related. We're so similar. And I think that, when it comes to places like Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, where, they had some embarrassing moments in the Second World War where they sided with Nazi Germany, and there were all these kinds of issues that arose around that they've worked really hard to sort of put that aside and become these more open societies. But at the same time, I have a master's student who's writing about the Istanbul Convention and about gender-based violence and support for gender-based violence. At the same time, they also have higher incidences of reporting of gender-based violence. So, the question is there more reporting because we're willing to have a conversation about it? Probably. But that doesn't mean that we're not having a lot of it, which is problematic. And are we addressing it? So, I think that we look really good on paper. And this is what Þorgerður Einarsson in Gender Studies has said, is that we really do look good as on paper for these multiple different gender equity measurements. But when it comes down to it, in the society, what's really happening? These are only, they tend to be very specific measures that are measuring, number of women in parliament, number of women in corporations, that kind of thing. But they're not looking at, for example, that in Iceland, the proportion of immigrant women who go to the one women's shelter that's on the island is much higher than the Icelandic women. What does that mean?
Shall we go back to this quota question? So there's a question, is there
Yes.
a quota at Austrian universities? And that's actually the same quota as it is in Iceland. So it's also 40% on all committees and so on, which is, and Silke can actually tell you more about this, which is a problem for us very often, because of course we don't have 40% of faculty. So this means that for the women we have as faculty, they have a lot to do in all committee work and so on. So that's also part of the picture, of course. And so I've also thought it's interesting that you mentioned these specific challenges we are facing. That we feel that our impact in this area is limited, and that it's hard to recruit colleagues for work in this area and on committees and whatever. So I think that's something we can very well relate to from our experience, would be my feeling, at least. You mentioned that the general perception of the Icelanders themselves is there's no social, basically no class difference in Iceland. So this is not at all a topic also at the universities, because it is a topic, for example, at Austrian universities, a very strong topic now, social status and class as a diversity dimension, so to say, we are focusing on. So is that, does it not come up at all in Iceland, or is it only hidden behind this self-image of Icelanders?
In a way, it's still hidden. We've got a couple of people. We just graduated a doctoral student that focused on this sort of class distinction and did it around sort of the idea of school choice and how families and parents select the neighborhoods that they live in based on their cultural or economic capital, and then how that impacted on the school choice. Because you're entitled here by law to go to your neighborhood school. So people select where they live based on the reputation of certain schools and stuff like that. And there's 2 or 3 people that have just started talking about it in the last 10 years. But sort of on a public level, it's not really a conversation that's being had. And it's one of the things that I've sort of brought up since I came back in terms of the student bodies, because, prior to, 20 years ago, we were getting students from very specific secondary schools. There are 3 different types of secondary schools here in Iceland. There's an academic one, there's sort of more technical version, and then there's combinations of a couple that are a combination of the two. But the academic ones, there are 4 or 5 of them, and most of the people that came out of those would track into the university and would track into certain fields. Certain secondary schools would then, this school would attract students into law and medicine. This school would do it into arts and theater and that kind of thing. Not intentionally. The schools aren't set up necessarily that way, but it sort of, they got these reputations for it. So it was a lot, and the people that were going to these schools were middle-class educated, from a middle-class educated families. So we were getting, middle-class students. So, everybody had the same rule book. If you look at, how Annette Leroux talks about, that middle-class cultural and social preparation that you get in school to be able to perform at the secondary, at the university level. And then in recent years, that's changed significantly. The laws changed. Anybody can go to secondary school. All secondary schools have to accept students. There's still a quota lottery for some of the more popular secondary schools. But that meant then that we were getting students who were differently prepared, who were first generation, and where there's much more of that now. And it's a hard conversation, because I keep having it with faculty where they're like, no, these students, they're just not as good as they used to be. And I'm like, no, they're just as good. They just have different preparation and a different background of support in order to perform. We need to change how we think about what we're doing with them, rather than thinking about how they aren't fitting our normative framework. And it's an interesting conversation, because people are still like, what do you mean first generation students? Because we're still expecting them to come from these elite secondary schools, and they're not, and it changes the conversation within the school, within the teaching, and it's a good thing. It's not a bad thing,
Mm-hmm. How big is the migrant community at universities compared to the population?
One of the interesting and sad things about that is we actually don't know. Because of this, as I mentioned before, the Norwegian and Sweden's connection to Nazi Germany, we follow their policies of identifying people. So we actually don't, the university does not collect data on race, ethnic identity, and that kind of thing. We do know often the languages, but in general, that's really difficult to dig up. So my guess is we're probably around 7%, maybe, and that's for certain groups of people. Not like, for example, the largest proportion of our 30% of the immigrant population is Polish speaking, and we maybe have 2% of the student body which is Polish speaking.
Mm. Well, that's interesting. I mean, and it goes back to the sort of the visibility of diversity, doesn't it? I mean, I remember that. I mean, we grew up in a world where there were only very few boxes to tick, and I remember that when I went to the US and I was asked about all sorts of things, I was, how dare you? I mean, that's none of your business, and of course that goes back to, as you said, I mean, that goes back to a governance of surveillance and et cetera, et cetera. But the result is, and we have the same thing, that we don't know. There's many things we really do not know about our students or about faculty, etc. So I mean, then we need to also change our view on this, and just dig out more information about the student population and the student communities. Yeah, I mean. And again, it goes back to, it's a question of visibility, isn't it? I mean, if we all pretend that there is no diversity, because there is no diverse student body, then we don't get any further.
Mm-hmm.
But
I mean,
sorry.
So it could be argued. I mean, my argument is, because it isn't that obvious here at the institution, but for me, that's beside the point. we should be doing diversity regardless. Even if we are all white and middle class, it doesn't matter, because the white and middle class people here need to know how to deal with everybody in society, because we're not just in this institution. So for me, even if I don't see this diverse representation, I think we always need to be doing diversity.
Mm. But because we had this conversation, for example, with our friends, AURORA friends in Duisburg, Essen, you know, about monitoring, which is an important issue, actually. I mean, we have, you know, in Innsbruck, we have much more statistics and numbers we are using. That's something different. But Duisburg Essen was on the forefront of doing diversity monitoring, I think, among German universities, diversity monitoring. And it's so are there ideas to implement something like that, or is that because of that specific national approach of non-visibility, is that a no-go somehow for the institution?
We've been working on it. It is one of the things that we've sort of constantly been bringing up to the institution, and we're getting more and closer to it. But because it's a public university, we're also tied to the National Statistics Database, and they don't gather, I mean, they gather data on nationality, and if you take Icelandic nationality, you disappear. You know, you just become part of the data of the Icelanders, you know, so it's bigger than just the institution. It's a national concern, and getting the government to see that is a little bit more complicated, especially with the way that their attitude currently, like the Office of Immigration, is very difficult and very negative towards immigrants.
Mm-hmm. But this means that, you know, when you say that there are 14% of immigrants in Iceland, they hold Icelandic citizenship.
No. So
No.
we have
special status.
Yeah, these are those. The 14% is simply first and second generation immigrants.
Okay.
So it's not. For instance, counting me. Because I count as what they call of foreign origin, because I have one parent who was not Icelandic.
Okay.
So yeah, it's just people who are first and second generation, and that means their parents, either their parents, or their grandparents were born elsewhere.
Yeah. Can you? I'm just curious, because you mentioned this, that you have this. These debates now on cancel culture. So what triggers debates on cancel culture in Iceland?
A lot of it has to do with, you know, a variety of different types of sexual violence. The head of our national football league, like the football Knattspyrnusamband Iceland, so yeah, so it's the football league, had to step down because of allegations of sexual harassment of women soccer players or football players. And as I said before, there was a young woman who is Icelandic but is of immigrant origin, who came out and accused 4 very well-known men of sexually abusing her. And the result there's been this conversation around, you know, well, we can't say anything anymore, and it's very public. It happens on Facebook. It's happening in these online news media that everybody reads. It gets into, I mean, we've even had, you know, news programs where, you know, specialists have been interviewed about this. So that's, and people are getting really upset, and there's a lot of sides being taken, and you know, and so there's been a lot of conversation around cancel culture and what that means, and who's being subjected to it. We have this annual comedy thing that's done on New Year's Eve. There's a show that the state television puts on every year, and everybody at 10:30, everybody goes inside and watches this thing. And this year, one of the skits was this white middle class older guy knocking on doors, selling a little, you know, because they're so, you know, they're just suffering so badly, white middle class man keychain. As we sell these keychains for things like supporting our like rescue services and stuff like that. We have these things. So we sell these keychains and everybody knows what they are. And so this guy was selling this white middle class man, because, you know, they were having such a hard time, you know, and it was a joke. It was funny. It was actually one of the funnier jokes in the thing. But it's a very on the surface conversation that's happening just publicly across the board in Iceland in coffee rooms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Dirk also background is that we're planning an event in October on wokeness, cancel culture, academia and freedom. Just to go on this on the pathos, and try to look at the structures behind this internally and try to find out not as a online battle that, you know, who's allowed to say what and stuff, but what's the language, what are the structures behind it. And I think it's a very interesting topic.
Mm-hmm. Which is exactly around how we're trying to do it, because I mean it's a really touchy thing, you know. When we were trying to plan who do we have in the panel, we don't want to give anybody, you know, a voice that really could cause problems. I mean the whole thing around it, it's a really, you know, sensitive thing to do. And I invite you guys, you're welcome to come, but I think it's all in Icelandic. Yeah. Well, same goes to you. I mean, I don't know how good your German is, but high school level. Yeah, well, you might be. No, I think it's absolutely the same. You really have to, and you have to do a lot of research, because to actually find out about these people who you want to have on your stage, and who you want to talk to, because you don't want to talk to. That is right. I mean, you don't want to talk to everybody about this. Not on a public stage anyway.
Mm-hmm. But it's I mean, just maybe the last point, but that's actually amazing for a country, in talking about smallness, that you keep in academia everything in Icelandic. Mm-hmm. That's I don't know. It's somehow it's a surprise. I think no. I guess most of you would publish in English, right, in academia, or is there also a publication system in Icelandic? Oh yeah. Oh wow. Oh, yeah. Okay. I mean, part of it is, and you'll hear this from a lot of Icelanders. I mean, we're very concerned about our language, you know, because there are only 380,000 of us, and 14% of them are not native speakers. We're really concerned about the loss of the language. You know, I mean, it's remained pretty much the same since the 12th century. I mean, it's an old language. So we're very concerned about the maintenance of it. And it's actually one of the written sort of rules of the university that actually all undergraduate programming has to be taught in Icelandic, which causes a different diversity problem. Because if you're an immigrant, you don't feel comfortable speaking in Icelandic, how do you get a higher education? You've got to leave the island, you know. Yeah. So you know, the higher levels, you know, doctoral theses are expected to be done in English, because we don't have enough faculty to, you know, to serve as externals. And it's an exception if you do it in Icelandic. But, you know, one of your articles in your thesis could be in English, in Icelandic. We have several academic publications that are considered high level, so they get valued as the same as international publications, and that's based on an amount of how much they publish in both Icelandic and English, but you can publish in Icelandic in them. Mm-hmm. Okay, wow, that's very interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, it looks like we are at the very end of our whole semester show here.
Yes, we are. And the final point, we had another question in the chat, which is a technical one, and I will address this. It's again the question when the essays are due. We would expect to hear from you with an essay by the 28th of February, which is sort of the end of the official semester here. You can either upload this essay on the OLAT platform, the ones you've been using, or you can send it to the technical support, Christian Konz. You can send it to Dirk or to myself. If you have any problems complying with this date, please let us know. Do talk to us and we'll find a way. But it's important that we hear from you.
Yes. Okay.
These are the final technical words. Dirk, do you want to have a last say to wrap up the show?
I mean, first we need to thank Brynja. It was really a pleasure to have you, and extremely interesting to learn something about Iceland. And of course, that's also part of the whole thing. I mean, we had quite a ride, I think, during this term. It was extremely interesting with all the colleagues from the AURORA partner universities. And of course, hopefully we will meet in person very soon. I think that's our next project, realizing that at one of our partner universities to meet the diversity group, so to say. It would be extremely interesting, I think. But nonetheless,
it was my pleasure. Thank you very much. And I look forward to having more conversations with you guys.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the message to everybody out there. Stay tuned. You will hear from us a lot more on doing diversity in higher education.
We need to thank Christian Konz for technical support. That's extremely important. He kept us going here over the whole term, which was not so easy, but thank you for that. So thanks for following us during this term. I'm sure we will have a AURORA lecture, brown bag lecture series in one of the upcoming terms with another topic maybe. And so stay tuned and stay safe and healthy, and hope to see you again.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye. See you.